Thank you very much, Roland. So as I was saying there, I'm going to start giving a very quick gallop through, I'm afraid, on the project we've been doing in the Isle of Staffa. We've actually been doing that for quite a number of years now. It's an ongoing project. There was a little bit of a hiatus, as there was with many things during COVID, but we're planning to restart this project in the next year or so. And at the end of talking about Staffa and the work we've been doing there, I'm hoping I will have 5 or 10 minutes left just to introduce another project which is not finished, live and running, but I think might be of interest to you. I'm hoping, but it follows on nicely from the work that we've done in Staffa, and that's the Unpath'd Waters project, and I'll introduce that. Hopefully, if I have time, if I aim to finish in time, I'll try and give myself 5 or 10 minutes just to talk about that project. So, on the Isle of Staffa, just in case anybody doesn't know where it is, it's a very small island, about 1.5 kilometers by 1 kilometer, just off the west coast of the Isle of Mull there. It's extremely famous for a number of things, most notably the columnar basalt formations, which the entire island is constructed of, with this overburden of tufa, and it's also famous for its wildlife, in particular its puffin colony, which draws a lot of visitors. And it is, I know many of you will have visited it, so I'm not going to dwell on this, but it is an astonishingly unusual place in terms of rock formations. Obviously, columnar basalt occurs elsewhere in the world, Giant's Causeway and so on, and in fact globally in Iceland and so on. But actually, this is probably one of the best examples of this particular type of formation. And since Joseph Banks brought it to the attention, the existence of the island and the existence of Fingal's Cave, the sea cave on the island, to the attention of polite society in 1772, it became almost immediately focus of early Romantic tourism. It fitted, as I'll explain, it fitted very, very well into the Romantic notions of landscape, and consequently, it was a catalyst for some of the vast range of European artists. Most famously, Felix Mendelssohn, of course, with the Hebridean Overture being inspired by the sound of the waves at the back of the cave, but also J.M. Turner, more recently, in inverted commas, people like Jules Verne set some of his novels, The Green Bay in particular, on the Isle of Staffa. And there's a vast range of poetic literature, music, painting, right up to this day. I mentioned Pink Floyd were inspired and wrote a song called Fingal's Cave, but there's a huge range, especially in folk music. It's not all great, the artistic responses, I have to say. The Kilted Vampires from Bride of the Isles and was focused on was set in Fingal's Cave. There's a very interesting story behind why the vampires wear kilts there, which I probably don't have time to go into, but we can come back to. But I do want to draw your attention to here an albumen print from an ink wash drawing there, which weirdly you might think shows St. George and the dragon. Well, it's actually St. George and the pterodactyl, as you can see from that image. And you will also note that the whole image, St. George and the pterodactyl, was set inside Fingal's Cave. And this hints at a very interesting aspect of the entire history of tourist, artistic, and creative response to Fingal's Cave, is that it sits very much in a nexus between the mythical, for example, Fingal and Fingal's the Tales of Ossian, as told to us by Macpherson. It sits there with a whole plethora of stories relating to mermaids and giants and so on. and the fact that there is a, scientifically speaking, it's a really interesting geological oddity. In actual fact, that duality is what Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins was hinting at there with this drawing of St. George being a mythical creature and a dragon being a mythical creature. But of course, he's representing as a pterodactyl, because at the time he was producing this, the ideas about dinosaurs and the existence of dinosaurs and how the existence of dinosaurs under fossils might inform stories of dragons were beginning to come to the forefront of scientific thinking. I've already mentioned that Macpherson's epic poem, apparently composed by Ossian, but not, we now know, actually composed by Macpherson himself, references the story of Fingal, and the connections between Staffa and Fingal's cave in particular, are quite interesting, and I'll return to that later in this presentation. But I want to talk, just to give us some context about why I was so interested in this island, archaeologically speaking. I want to give us a little bit of context about people's responses. So this is what Banks was saying when he was talking to Pennant in 1774. He was blown away by this. He says, "The mind can hardly form an idea more magnificent than this space. Compared to this, what are the cathedrals or palaces built by men? Models or playthings, imitations, as diminutive as his works will always be when compared to those of nature." Keats, unfortunately, didn't respond with such flowery language. Keats says it's impossible to describe. And that sounds like a kind of poor response, but actually that's quite a significant response. Jules Verne goes on to say, who could be so dull a soul as to believe that it was not created by a god for sylphs and water nymphs, or for whom do the wandering winds strike music from this vast Aeolian harp? Surely it was unearthly music that Waverley had heard. So he's referring back there to Sir Walter Scott's Waverley and the Waverley story. So if we just look at these extracts about how inspired and how emotionally powerful this site was to Banks there, Keats I'll come back to, and then Jules Verne. When I first went there, essentially on a tourist boat in 2012 or 2013, I was similarly blown away. And the first thing that occurred to me was, when I started researching this, was, well, if this is having this massive impact on people now, or people in the early modern period, and inspiring as poets and artists, it must have had some impact on people in prehistory. So I decided to check up and find out what the archaeological activity had been in Staffa, how much research had been done around Staffa, and what the traces of any archaeology, but particularly prehistory, were. And I discovered that actually nobody had done anything apart from a walkover survey on the island at all. Partly this was because it was privately owned, only came into the possession of the NTS very late on in the last century. But it still struck me as quite remarkable that this site, which is clearly inspires awe and inspires people, and would no doubt have done so in the past, why it had not been investigated archaeologically. And I decided to follow that up, basically. So returning to this idea, where Verne is asking the question in 1859, who could be so dull a soul as not to believe that it was created for God or by gods for sylphs and water nymphs? Well, the answer is actually quite a lot of people, because since the 1970s, there's been no grazing on the island. So what we're looking at here, the top picture there, is a photograph taken in the 1970s, when grazing was still being undertaken. And everything we can see there, the rig and furrow, the banks, the beast management, the fanks, and so on. This is all now pretty much invisible because there's a vast overburden of vegetation, because essentially It's being managed for nature. It is a national nature reserve, in actual fact. So it's now considered a geological site and a national nature reserve. But as we can see, just from that photograph, it's a densely occupied island. There's a lot going on in this island. And in fact, Crane and Fletcher, who are art historians and looking at it from that perspective, point out or describe Staffa as a place burdened by culture. So why it's being managed for nature alone is quite an interesting question to me. Crane and Fletcher go on to talk about how Staffa epitomizes these central themes in Romanticism: power of nature, the relationship between nature, art and architecture, and so on, the sublime and the emphasis on the emotional. And this is where we refer back to the point about Keats saying it's indescribable. Actually, that ineffability, our inability to describe something because it's so overwhelming, was a real theme in Romanticism, and explains why they would have to respond to it using painting or music or poetry, because simply describing it in prose and words wouldn't actually capture the essence of the place. So since 2014, I've been engaged in a project which has been going out onto the island, carrying out investigations. It's called HARPS, which is the Historical and Archaeological Research Project on Staffa. We've had lots of different objectives. Part of this is looking for the materialities of romantic travel and tourism. I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. Looking at the remains of medieval and early modern settlement. Well, actually, the medieval's there in pottery, but it's vaguely absent otherwise. There's the early modern settlement. And also, we were very keen to look for evidence of prehistoric activity. And we intended to do this as part of the process, the standard activities, archaeological recording, desk-based assessment and historical assessment and so on. But we also intended to use the latest visualization and recording techniques to try and build up a record of the island. The idea being that we wanted to represent the island to wider audiences and actually continue with this process of creative engagement. And also ultimately to contribute to our understanding of the material and relational processes of placemaking around Staffa. So over the next 7 or 8 years, we've been involved in recording excavation exercises on Staffa. I just want to make this point. If you're thinking, well, why is it taking so long? There's an important point about Staffa for those of you who haven't been there, is that there's no water on the island. There's no accommodation on the island. It's completely uninhabited. All equipment, camping equipment, fresh water, and so on, has to be taken over to the island, and actually becomes quite difficult to work with, living and working on the island for longer than a week or so. So it's been done kind of in phase by phase. Although the next iteration of the project, I think, we'll be looking to stay there a little bit longer. One of the first things we did, as you would imagine, from my perspective anyway, was to undertake a laser scan survey of most of the south of the island, but in particular, Fingal's Cave, and we'll return to that. We also did a giant photogrammetric survey from the boat around the entire island. So one of the benefits of Staffa being 1.5 kilometers by 1.1 kilometers is actually getting into the scale of landscape that is possible to record using microtopographic survey, i.e. terrestrial LiDAR, which we did inside the cave and in some of the island, and photogravmetry and drone imagery and so on. So it's at a scale, the island's at a scale that we're getting to the point where we can actually model the entire island. I want to talk about one of the initial discoveries before we go on and talk about the excavations and prehistory. And this was really rather unexpected. So here's a photograph of us, photograph on the left there. is looking into Fingal's Cave itself on a very nice calm day, I have to say. It's not always like that. You can just see us there at the back of the cave towards the left. And we were going in there, and we were doing the laser scanning, and we were doing sound recordings and so on. And we suddenly became aware, or I became aware, that actually this cave is full of thousands upon thousands of pieces of graffiti. Much of it tourist graffiti, much of it overwritten as a kind of palimpsest, but much of it actually very early, certainly into the early 19th century, and potentially later than that as well. And so this is interesting in its own right if you happen to be interested in historic graffiti. But actually, there's another layer of interest to this. So I'll talk about RTI in a minute. There's another layer of interest in this, which is that we started coming across very particular types of graffiti which I'd not come across before in caves. I know you're interested in recording methodologies. I just wanted to point out that we undertook quite a large campaign of reflectance transformation imaging, recording inside the cave. I don't know whether people in NOSAS have come across that technology before. It's an extremely useful technology and very simple, photographically based. It's a very simple technology for capturing lightly inside surfaces and allowing them to be lit differentially. It actually captures a normals map. It allows them to be lit differentially after the fact. If people are interested, I may have time at the end of this to give you a quick demo of that. So here's the kind of graffiti that you would expect. You can see there's one up there saying Cameron 1871. The one underneath is nickel. Unusually, there's a Star of David associated with that, and that motif turns up more than once inside Fingal's Cave. And we don't know for sure, but I suspect this is because of the association with Felix Mendelssohn. There's certainly one other I'm going to show you. But this is a thing that was much more unexpected. There's a whole range of graffiti relating to naval vessels. Hopefully you can make this out. It's not ideal without RTI, but that top one says HMS Electo. There's more than one HMS Electo. The Royal Navy in particular recycles ship names over time. So unless you've actually got data associated with it, it's quite difficult to figure out which HMS Electo it is. I think it's probably the one that was seeing active service during the Second World War, and I'll come back to why that is. And here's another example. We got exceedingly excited when we saw in the graffiti the name Quinton Roosevelt. I immediately thought, well, this is amazing. This means that the son of the US president, Theodore Roosevelt, had visited the cave and described his name. That seems unlikely, actually, and there's no record of him doing that. And he actually died in an air crash in the First World War. However, during the Second World War, a French fisheries protection vessel, Flamand, was co-opted by the Royal Navy and renamed the HMS Quinton Roosevelt. And we know that that was active, moving men and supplies between Oban and Loch Ireland, the commando training base, in actual fact, Loch Ireland. So almost definitely the crew of the Quinton Roosevelt, or some members of the crew of the Quinton Roosevelt, stopped on that trip from Oban to Loch Ireland and went into Fingal's Cave and added to the maritime graffiti. There was a whole range of graffiti in there relating to ships and vessels. And the analysis of that and the research into that is actually still ongoing. But it is an example of these material traces of tourism. Oh yes, I also, one of the reasons that we're quite, I'm fairly sure that that the HMS Electo there is actually the one that was active during the Second World War, is because of the the sheer number of vessels from that period where they're inscribed in these groups. These groups of crewmen were inscribing their names together and putting boxes around themselves and putting the date 1939. There is much earlier vessels. There's 19th century vessels as well, but there's a huge range of them who were clearly active in that area during the Second World War. The final piece of graffiti I'm going to show you, which I think is shows you kind of how you can strike lucky. You may be able to see there's a top line which seems essentially to be well, gobbledygook. Underneath it there's a date, AD 1850, and there's another Star of David in association with this piece of graffiti. This actually sits slightly outside the cave. Underneath is in Latin, Dulcissima Solitudo, sweet solitude. This had us, I have to say, this had me in particular stumped for quite a long time, until I was doing some research on graffiti and came across this piece of graffiti, which actually is in the Dwarfy in Orkney, which is it's actually a boulder that's been hauled out and converted into a burial chamber in the Neolithic. And there is a piece of graffiti inside that tomb, which has the same gobbledygook and a piece of Persian written underneath it. Very peculiar. But we know where this gobbledygook comes from. It is Mounsey Gilemus written backwards, which actually is Gilemus Mounsey, which actually is a Latinized version of William Mounsey. And we know that William Mounsey visited Orkney, was touring many of these archaeological sites in the 1850s. And clearly he'd gone to Staffa probably on the same trip. He himself is a really, really interesting character. We know quite a lot about him because he was one of these rather extraordinary Victorian gentleman adventurers, and a bit of a cad, I think, actually. He was a British soldier, antiquarian. He had a very strong interest in Persia, and in particular in Jewish culture. He was actually known as the Jew of Carlisle, in actual fact. That was his nickname. And he's responsible for those graffitis in Scotland, but he's also responsible for quite a lot of rock carving around about Rockcliffe in Carlisle. So it was really nice to be able to discover something and actually unpick it back to its original, given that that's been there since 1850 and it hadn't really been picked up and is not in the record at all. So back to what might be considered more traditional. We're looking at test pitting and geophysics in the first couple of years in 2014, 2016. This is where this idea about it being managed by nature and having a vast overburden of vegetation becomes slightly problematic. We could not get resistance to work in it because there was too much overburden, nor could we get GPR to work on it because there's simply too much overburden. This is a really unfortunate thing, but actually, as long as it's not being grazed and the overburden remains, which I think it should do because it's there for the bird life and so on. Basically, this site is not amenable to any form of geophysics, so we had to apply quite a lot in test pitting. Fortunately, the test pitting turned out to be extremely successful, and we picked up quite a lot of material, flint and pottery. And this is slightly larger than the test pit. This is our first kind of exploratory excavation, which takes place outside what looks like a ruined structure. I'll come back to that. In this pit here, we started picking up what looks like twisted cord decoration pottery from the Bronze Age. Confusingly, we're also getting later prehistoric pottery, quite a thick base, and we now think this is most likely Iron Age. This is all coming out of this really rather small, not much more than a test pit. It's essentially an extended test pit. So we're getting quite a lot of stuff, and also we're going back to the Neolithic. So rather pleasingly for me, we go from the situation where there's been no archaeological investigations to a situation within one tiny test pit. We've gone back through the Iron Age into the Bronze Age and potentially into the Neolithic as well. So that this goes without saying, piques our interest enormously. And I will return to the prehistory in just a second. However, in terms of excavation, one of the things we were interested in was these material histories of travel and tourism. Some of you may be familiar with M.E.M. Donaldson, the women photographer, quite trailblazing women photographer. And these three images are all the same structure. So there's Pancook's 1830 structure, and it shows a little roofed cottage on the island, a little roofed structure on the island. If we look at M.E.M. Donaldson's 1930s photographs, you can see there's what seems like a very roughly built structure with a kind of makeshift roof put on top of it. And if we go back a few years earlier, this is Calmac workmen using what's being referred to as the ruined bothy, and you can see that rather interesting arch in that illustration. Well, it turns out that actually, after the island was cleared around about 1815, the owner essentially built a ruin to encourage tourism and to give tourists somewhere to shelter. It was never really originally intended to be roofed. It was essentially constructed as a romantic ruin. And that arch, which has led many people to think, perhaps this is an early ecclesiastical site, is essentially a confection. There it is there. Actually, you can see it. Unbelievably, that is the only good occupation site on the island. It doesn't look that hospitable in this photograph. We had significant problems getting access to excavate it for an unexpected reason, in that it being made of dry stone walling, it was absolutely full of nesting storm petrels who have a really annoyingly long nesting season, which meant that we actually had to head over in March, very early in the season, and we had our loins girded for extremely bad weather and all the rest of it. Actually, as it happened, we had a week excavating the island as you can see, it was t-shirt weather, quite remarkable in actual fact. We were really interested to find out whether this was had an earlier occupation, whether the house was reused, or whether it was simply constructed in that 1815, 1820 period. And the assemblage, very interesting if you're interested in early modern assemblages. But this pretty much confirmed to us that actually what we were looking at was a constructed ruin that was, interestingly enough, constructed from using material that was robbed out from the one or two rough early modern houses, cottages, black houses that were actually been on the island. And there's some quite interesting things. I think you can see the ceramics with the banding there, are potted meats from Pictics and so on. Quite a lot of stoppers from bottles. There was an entire smashed up whiskey bottle. People were using the bothy for recreational purposes rather than for domestic purposes. So back to work that was done following on from this in 2017, 2018, where we expanded that initial trial trench quite extensively. And we are turning up a huge assembly of pottery, which has been carbon dated from burnt grain material and associated context to the Bronze Age. Really lovely stuff, very highly decorated, lots of flint material. And I have to stress that this trench, again, is not a big trench, but it's very rich with this kind of material, including this fantastic rim sherd of what looks like a bait, but unfortunately We are just looking at that body and rim shard there. However, it is not entirely without possible analogues. And the nearest we could get to, or the nearest thing we could find that looks like it may be similar, is on Islay, is Killallen Farm in Islay near Loch Grinart, which was turning up. Well, the first thing is if we go back and have a look at this photograph here, it's not very apparent in that photograph, but there is a kind of curve. The women in the purple top in the trench, you might be able to see there's a kind of curvilinear feature that starts in the bulk behind her and curves out in front of the man with the mattock. And they're actually putting a section through it there, which is ditch-like. In Killallen Farm, there was this beaker burial complex. You can see it up there. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but it's up there on the top right of this image. And we don't know, because we need to extend the trenches, but I'm beginning to wonder if that's actually what we're looking at here. And pleasingly, the pottery assemblage from Killallen is also not at all dissimilar to the kind of pottery assemblage that we've been picking up in Staffa, with the exception of one extremely wide, broad vessel, which is clearly not fired on the island, has been brought over to the island, and the origins of that actually remain a little bit of mystery, but we've only got smaller fragments of that. So I think I've just got a little bit of time to talk about one of the other really interesting aspects of Fingal's Cave. And that is one of those sites, and there's a few of them around the country, but this is a very good example of a site where the sound that's associated with it, the acoustics that are associated with it, are actually intrinsic to the understanding of the site. I'm talking here specifically about Fingal's Cave, but actually it applies to the whole of Staff Island itself, as we'll see from some of these quotes. Wordsworth is amongst many people who talk about the cave being a tuneful cave, very poetically. The ocean has proved its strength and its grace, it's in calm, is conscious, finding for his freight of softest music some responsive place. I'm going to refer back now to Fingal, Macpherson and Fingal, and I apologise in advance to any Gaelic speakers up there, but my understanding of the Gaelic for Fingal's Cave, or the Gaelic for tuneful cave or melodious cave, are actually very similar. So Uavin or Uavin would be melodious or fins. Interesting enough, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think it may well have been understood by populations throughout history that it was the melodious cave and it was Fingal's Cave. And just to reinforce that it's not just the cave that has the interesting acoustics, so that's what we focus on. Here's a really nice quote from Professor McQueen talking about 1887, about a shepherd and his family who'd been persuaded to go there, but they ended up begging to be removed because of the roar made by the sea through the caverns during the storms. To a superstitious people, there would be something more than natural forces in the fetch of the ocean, which bursts through these pilloried portals with the sound of artillery. That all sounds very flowery, but I have to tell you, in August 2017, me and some colleagues who were working in the island were basically trapped in the island for 3 or 4 days because there was a massive storm blew in off the Atlantic. And there's several caves on the Isle of Man. And when the seas are very high, they crash into these waves, into these caves in sequence, and I can assure you, and this is no exaggeration, is that quote makes it sound very poetic and flowery, pilloried portals with the sound of artillery, it genuinely does sound like cannon fire or gunfire or something really, really profound. And you can hear it in Iona, which is 6 miles away. When there's very big seas, you can actually hear these responses coming off Fingal's Cave. So one of the things we were interested in doing was capturing the acoustics of the cave. I'm going to maybe try and play this and see if can people hear that? No.
Not yet.
Okay, no, it doesn't matter. It's just an example of a sound speaker. It's one of the techniques we use for essentially acoustically modeling a space. These are tones that go from very, very low to very high frequencies, and we use directional microphones, and you can kind of then construct a model of what the acoustic response of the place is. I doubt we'll be able to hear these either, will we?
Sadly not.
Okay, no, that's okay. Again, so what having the acoustic model actually allows you to do is to extract the ambient sound. So you just have the acoustic response of the space itself, and you can then take sounds that are known as dry sounds, i.e. recorded without their own acoustic reflections, and insert them into that space. So you can essentially make them sound as if they were coming from inside Fingal's Cave. And what this has allowed us to do, amongst other things, is to bring together all those data sets I was talking about, these large-scale data sets that we've been recording, the photogrammetric data sets, the laser scan data sets to do with the cave, plus the acoustics, and generate. This is a clip of a demo. This is not the actual finished product. It's just to give you an idea of the virtual reality experience that we've been working to create. And this is an experience that allows people to don a headset, become fully immersed, and actually begin to experience the cave. I'm not going to say as if they were there, which is an important point, but it gives them a richer experience of what it might be like to be there. I think is what I would want to say there. And that leads on quite nicely to the last element of this project that I want to mention, which is this idea of taking our work and inserting it back into that very long continuum of creative response, going right back to Pennant and Daniel, the engraver, right up through this, with Turner and Mendelssohn, and I'm not comparing myself with these people, I have to say, but what I'm saying is a long continuum of artistic response. And actually, we had the ability, with the help from the BBC, we commissioned a composer called Aaron May, who actually composed new music. He'd never been to Fingal's Cave. He'd only ever been in the virtual environment, and he wrote a new piece of music in response to that. And if you're interested, and I can share these with you later, again, you can enjoy the immersive experience on YouTube or in a headset if you happen to own one. It's 360 video on YouTube with Aaron May's music. There's a BBC Radio 3 documentary that was actually done about this project and the recording. And it featured in the Edinburgh International Arts Festival, and there's a program website for you there. So I'm going to leave Staffa there. I hope there's questions that I've raised there, because I'm aware that I've gone through there a real gallop. But I just want to introduce you to a new project. So this is a kind of glimpse into the future. This project, it's been running for a year, but it's got a year and a bit, but it's got a year more to run. But I thought this might be particularly interesting to you, given the types of activities that I know NOSAS get up to in terms of recording, including in the maritime environment. This project's called Unpath'd Waters. It's a 3-year project, and I'm not going to read all that out. I'm going to tell you essentially, in essence, what it's intending to do is to take the maritime heritage data sets held by Historic Environment Scotland, Cadw in Wales, Historic England. The Manx are included in this as well, Manx National Heritage, and also the DOE in the Isle of Man. Take their maritime heritage data sets, which you may currently access via CanMore, and combine them into a single cross-searchable data set. They're also intending to enhance that data set. So the first stage is this aggregation. As every project in the world is, we'll be using artificial intelligence for data enhancement. So aggregation and characterization is University of York and the Archaeology Data Service, along with some partners in Ariadne in Europe. The artificial intelligence work is being done by the University of Southampton. Other aspects of looking at the maritime heritage data set are being done by colleagues in the University of Plymouth and Doggerland. Some of you may be aware of the Paleolithic environment underneath the North Sea prior to the collapse of the land bridge between the continent and the UK. That's known as Doggerland. That was work done by the University of Bradford. They're also involved in this project as our colleagues looking at who the potential audiences might be for these types of data. What I've been involved in is working to generate a way of interacting and searching with those data sets that isn't a simple web interface. And we've been looking at the idea of exploring these very rich data sets, about 90,000 records, exploring these using virtual reality, a fully immersive system. And we've been doing this by going about a quite involved and rigorous co-design process. So we've been working with a number of audiences, notably a non-coastal community audience who are actually based in Dumfries and Galloway, an audience with quite extreme accessibility issues, visually impaired persons. There's a group we've been working with in London, and also there's a group of cross-disciplinary researchers. So we have our audiences, and essentially we've been working together through this iterative co-design process where it starts off very general. Lots of ideas are thrown into the mix. Lots of people contribute what they think is right, good, and appropriate way of interacting with the data and exploring it. It's a very iterative process, as I said. So there tends to be we start with some very general discussions around heritage, maritime heritage, what people's experiences have been with it in the past, and we go through iterations where we become more and more specific about what we're actually interested in, until in the end we're answering some extremely specific questions about how people would want to navigate in a virtual reality environment, how they might actually want to run these searches. And underpinning this is basically a piece of research where we're trying to discover whether virtual reality will do this, whether virtual reality, which is becoming more and more ubiquitous, is actually a good technology for this. And we have a very open mind about it, about whether it works in this context or not. We don't need to know that. That's the so some example of the work we've been doing. This actually is our visually impaired participants based out in the Museum of London Archaeology Service. We've been working with them. We're doing some demonstrations for them, and we're getting feedback from them through these workshops. Some things are quite generic about how you might want a heads-up display with 3D data landscapes and so on. Some of them are kind of more conceptual about where and how people might want to be in an environment when they're exploring the maritime heritage. The middle quote there talks about actually about the relationship between the land and the sea and how that might be worked out. And the final quote there is just an example quote from one of our cross-disciplinary researchers who's talking about comparing topographic features with bathymetric features, and maybe trying to flip the model so you're representing bathymetric features, as a lot of the records, these 90,000 records, are actually shipwrecks, apart from anything else. So I won't go into too much detail here. Again, it's just to say that when this is launched, which will be later on this year, that each of the things that we're doing inside that environment, each of the actions and the ideas about navigability and how you actually actively search for things, each of these have been co-designed with these particular user groups. And here are some examples of the test environments that we've been using, just to give you an idea of the kind of things we're doing. On the right-hand side there, this is the idea of spatialized audio for in-world navigation. I've talked a little bit about spatialized audio. In a VR environment, what this means, in essence, is that much like stereo, in actual fact, but with a visual component, you know where in the space that sound is coming from. So it allows you to build both very atmospheric soundscapes, but it actually also allows you to convey information about closeness and how close things are, how far away they are, by using this spatialized sound. We've also, the image there on the bottom right is the actual Unpath'd Waters search portal, which is online now. I'll give you the link to it at the end of this. People might be interested in exploring it if they haven't already. But this is an attempt to integrate that portal interface into the VR immersive environment. And this is a little bit of an example showing how we were responding, for example, to that quote I showed you a couple of slides ago, where we're looking at bathymetric data about how we're actually building an environment based on bathymetric data sets that we then subsequently populate with these 90,000 records, which are aggregated from across the country. Quite interesting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing that, and I'm going to start sharing something else, just to give you a very sneak preview. I hope you're interested in what one of our prototype. This is not by no means a finished example, but what one of our prototype environment looks like. The first thing you'll notice is that so what we're doing is this is a video recording of what it looks like through somebody's headset. So that's why it's shaking about, because that person is moving their heads, as it were. It's a bit discombobulating to watch. But the first thing I want to point out is that we're the number of settings you can change to tailor the environment for yourself, and this is directly in response to accessibility issues that have been raised by people in the group with visual impairment. There's a whole range of visual impairments, and this is them asking for lots of different settings that you can vary so that you can respond to lots of different levels of visual impairment. If I run on a little bit to look at the database searching mechanism. So what we can see here, or we're about to see, is various physical items in the environment that represent types of things you might want to search for. So, for example, that one there represents cargo. So if you're interested in records that contain references to cargo, you might select that object. Or there's another, you might be interested in people. So for example, you'll see that this is crew lists, migration, or records to do with the slave trade. But what we're going to do is pick up a submarine, say we're interested in submarines, drop it in there, and you will see in the background the British Isles with the shipping forecast areas, which not normally used in heritage, but actually a very good way for us to segment those 90,000 records, which are actually quite difficult to handle in their totality. So we have Fair Isle selected there. That's the up at the top, and submarines. If we then run the query, just we go down and say run that query, there you get points in space representing those. I'm stressing that this is a prototype, so what we're actually seeing in terms of data here and is not what you'll be seeing in the end. Although, so if I just go back there, you can see that what the pink ones are selected, so the kind of selection and deselection process going on there. But when you interrogate an individual, so that there's an individual object in the record, this is actually U1206, which is a submarine in the North Sea. There's much more information that will be associated. This is, as I say, it's essentially a prototype to allow us to experiment with that. So that's a very quick, sneaky preview of something that's going to come up. There will be a number of exhibitions taking place all over the country, in actual fact, for all the Unpath'd Navigator in its final form. Our partners in the National Maritime Museums. It'll be down in Greenwich. It'll be down in something called the Discovery Bus. It's definitely coming up to Glasgow, and it's definitely going to Orkney. And I would have to check, but I would be surprised if it wasn't also coming to a location in Inverness. And if it isn't, and people are interested, I can see where we can get that demonstrator product available for people to actually have a look at and have a play with. I'd be happy to do that if you're interested. So there is the website for Unpath'd Waters, and that contains the web-based portal and lots of information about the site. I've just noticed the photograph there is by Tom Dawson. I believe that some of you know Tom Dawson from University of St Andrews. He's also a partner in this project. He's helping us with audio, video recording and soundscapes and so on.